So, life events, what we've been talking about is how we build bridges to those on the edge of church who come to us, and perhaps how we build bridges ourselves to get more involved with supporting this ministry. And in this short session, we're going to be talking about what I'd say times of joy in people's lives, which are baptisms or christenings, and there is sometimes a bit of two words being used there, and I'll just use them both, and of course weddings. These can be more complex than seeing them as times of joy. They can be overshadowed by sadness and pain. But on the whole, we're talking about celebrations, marking a special celebratory moment in people's lives. And sometimes we wonder why on earth people still choose the church. And sometimes we can judge their reasons and we say things like, well, you know, they're only coming because they want to get married in a pretty church, although not all of us have a pretty church. And one of the good things about the research that we've done is we've been discovering a lot more about not what we assume people might be thinking, but what they might actually be thinking when they come along. So in this short talk, I'm just going to share some top line motivations that those who come to us might have. And to some extent they overlap, but in particular, these are the ones that have emerged when we think about people who bring a child to be baptised. Maybe they don't seem to have been to church before. We don't really know them in the community. So why have they chosen to do this in a culture where it's no longer required? You know, it really is a minority thing. It's important to remember that. Only about kind of 1 in 6 or 7 families will now be choosing this. So it's really dropped. That will vary across each place depending on the local situation. So they've chosen to do it, and we discovered in our research that there were kind of 3 main groups of reasons. First of all, people do see this as being a moment when they are on a faith journey. Often we'll see it as opening doors to the possibility of faith, whereas we might have thought it was closing doors. You know, you've nailed your colours to the mast, you've had your baby baptised, you've done it now. But actually they think later they'll be able to choose what to do. And also they themselves may have had more experience of faith than we ever realise. And it's always worth asking any parent that you meet, whether they're through church or as on the street, in the neighbourhood, at the toddler group, wherever you help, just where else they've had contact with church. Young parent might have gone to a church school, for example. They might be really admiring of a grandparent's faith and connection with church. And you yourselves in church might know one another, maybe grandparents or parents, and know others that you can share with. So being on a faith journey is a motive. But very interesting one is a whole group of reasons that are about making a good start in life. We also discovered that, you all know this, any of you who've had children, grandchildren, whatever it is, will know that having a child is a huge responsibility. And you've suddenly got this little one in your arms who is vulnerable, who's dependent on you, and that amazing worry suddenly about the world that lies ahead of them. And no one sort of looks at their little one and says, do you know, I want them to grow up to be a horrible person. People want them to make good choices going forward, however much the odds are stacked against them. They actually start thinking, do you know, I want them to make good choices. I want them to make the best of their life. I want them to be protected. And right now, if you're having a child right now in this world, you'd look around, there's so much to worry about. What are the worries and fears that parents have as they bring a child? And they want to put them on the right path. They'll often use language like that. And for many parents, being baptised, becoming affiliated, signing up to being Christian is very much about making good choices in the future, that moral framework in their lives as well. And also, there's a huge need for people to belong. Community is still massively important. There are 2 groups of people that get identified in our culture as being lonely. One is our older generation, who are often identified as being lonely, but the other is young mums in particular. It can be a very lonely place to be. So belonging to something, feel connected is really important. It's sort of interesting to me that often young mums go from toddler group to toddler group through the week, looking for company, people to support them and help them. Their own family may live a long way away. It Getting involved with young families is a great way for lots of people to be involved in church. You know, it's where people who haven't got grandparents locally meet an older generation who share wisdom and common sense with them and so on. Really interesting thing. Belonging, feeling part of a community. People are hugely important. Sometimes people come to a church to ask to have their baby christened and they don't actually live near you. You know, they actually turn out to live on the brand new housing estate 20 miles away, 10 miles away. But they've come to your church, say, oh, can I have my baby christened? And you might say, or your vicar might have said, or your parish administrator, or you might have just met a family. And they say, oh, can we have our baby christened at your church? And they go, and you go, well, you could. And they say, well, I didn't really want it christened there. I'd like to go to that one back in this other place. And you go, oh, why? Oh, because my grandma and granddad were married there. It's what I call the who do you think you are story. You know, the connection to the past, the vertical community, that sense of belonging to something else. That people are saying, oh, I'm searching for that sense. So if someone turns up at your church, or you get that kind of query that says, oh, you know, can I have my baby baptised in a church there? Actually, do you know, maybe the answer should be yes, you could, because welcoming them is really, really important. But the most important people we discovered in our research to families when they bring a child to be christened is godparents. And one of the biggest changes we have made in the work we encourage churches to do is put quite simply in this one phrase, big up godparents. Do more than you ever think with godparents. The family think they're really important, or they hope they'll be really important. Do you know, it's possibly, apart from perhaps being married and having your own children, it'll be one of the longest relationships you'll ever have in your life is with your godchild. And many, many people are in touch with godchildren over years. It's worth asking at weddings sometimes, is your godmother going to be there? You know, it's an important relationship for people. Is your godfather still part of your story? So remember that godparents matter as well. And you may meet them in the community. And when you do, and someone says, oh, I've been asked to be a godparent, be ready to say, oh, that's great. You know, do you want to know any more about it? Because let me help you. You know, we can tell you more about what that means and so on. So, how do people get involved? Because often it's quite tricky with baptisms because you may not meet the family. The christenings may be happening in a separate service at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon and your worship happens at a different time. But it may be that you get a chance to meet families in your community. And when you do, one of the really important things is just reflecting the kind of language that they use. So when someone says, oh, I'm having my baby christened on Sunday, it's never really helpful to say, oh, at our church we baptised them actually. because it makes, imagine how you'd feel if someone said that. So, oh, that's really good. We call it, our vicar calls it baptism. It's the same thing really, you know, just helping them to feel comfortable. Thinking and remembering that they've been on a faith journey, asking them those connections that they might have had. Oh, that's really interesting that you want your little one to be christened. Were you christened? Have you know, what's your contact with church been? Did you go to church school? Oh, yeah, oh, I didn't, but do you know what we used to do? I had this one happen to me. I used to go to Scouts and it was amazing when we went to the cathedral. And, you know, who knew, you know, but it was a little bit of a moment of wonder that this dad wanted to be part of. So listening to those stories. Really importantly, this share the wonder and the worries. You know, we've been there. A lot of us listening have been there. We know what it's like, that moment when you've got a child and all the sleepless nights, all the joy and that incredible weird moment when you meet a baby for the first time. You think, oh my goodness. And then also the fears, the anxieties, you know, about bodily well-being, about mental health, about the world we live in. Hear those stories and share them and acknowledge them. Oh, you know, oh gosh, it is hard, isn't it? Do you know, we pray for babies at our church. You know, that's what you're doing. The praying is really important here. And, you know, ask them about who's going to be. The godparents are really interesting. So, oh, how are you choosing your godparents then? Oh, why? I love hearing those stories. Oh, why have you chosen those? Oh, you know, he was my best friend. I met him on the first day at primary school. That's amazing. Friendship is amazing. And now I want him to be part of my kid's life, you know. They're not all amazing. There's a lot of rubbish stories, of course. Let's get too rose-tinted. But actually, there are good stories to hear and acknowledge from people. Find out why people matter, what relationships are important. You, as members of a congregation, are in the community. You're the eyes and the ears, the people on the street. You hear the sounds of a community. You bump into people, you can hear what's really going on. And even if you do nothing else with that, just pray for it. But there may be other ways to get involved, of course. You may be able to volunteer to be part of a team that helps people get ready for baptism. That doesn't have to be some great big theological teaching. One church I know does a very simple thing of opening up a church on a Saturday morning for parents to come and look around to find out what goes on there. Actually, they really like doing it. A little visit round. Here's a pulpit. What happens in a pulpit? Here's a font. What happens in a font? Would you like to light a candle? You know, being there to show them what a church is as an active building. So you could be involved in all kinds of ways. You may be able to be there on the day. Now that might be because the baptism is happening in your main Sunday worship. And being there is really important. And I stress that because I know that none of you listening will ever do this, but I have heard stories of people who say things like, "Oh, Vicar, did you say there'd be a christening in the service on Sunday?" And your lovely smiley vicar says, "Yes, we're going to be, welcoming little John. I'll see you the week after." I'll see you the week after. Actually, you should be saying to yourself, "Yeah, hey, another one, another set of new people. How exciting is that to have new people coming?" And so be there in that Sunday worship. And when you are there on that Sunday worship, when they turn up with their 70 guests, most of whom don't know how to behave in church, big opportunity to be welcoming, to have hospitable hearts towards them and make them feel at home on that day. If it's separate in the afternoon, it can obviously feel a bit weird if 20 people from church rock up to this family's baptism. They weren't expecting it. But maybe you should ask if you can be there. It might be just a little job to do. You might be able to be there to welcome people at the door, to be the one that holds a candle. A really exciting way to get involved is through what I call prayer gifts. We have seen so many people's attitudes change around baptism families by making prayer gifts. What do I mean by that? Well, possibly the best one that I've heard, there are others, is the church where they began to knit squares to make a blanket. And so everybody got involved in knitting squares for each baptism family. It was sewn together, and then a little, one of those name tag things, we all have in our school clothes. Well, those little name tags, you can get them made. And it said on it, love from, St Ethelred's or whatever. Love from St Ethelred's. That's all it said. And they sewed that on the blanket. During the service at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 1 or 2 people from the congregation who'd knitted the blanket came to the service and wrapped the child in the blanket, because we're all welcoming you in the service, yeah? So you represent people, could get involved. And then everyone's involved because they're knitting, they're sewing it up, and maybe you're there on the day. Other churches knitting, I quite like the one that knits little angels for every child that's being baptised, give them a little angel. People do teddies. I prefer angels because it's got a bit more theological significance than the teddy. Sorry, teddy bears, I like you. But just that gifting, that prayer gifting. And encourage people, we talked about prayer in another talk, but encourage people to see that making something is an act of prayer in itself. As you knit, you're thinking of that child, holding them before God. So that gift holds that love, holds that prayerfulness. And it means so much to people, these simple things. So get involved in that way. On the slide, you'll see a picture of a treasure box, and some lovely gifted person managed to put lettering in this little cheap box, which came from a craft store. And in the box, it just said the christening, and on the lid of the box, it said the name of the child. And in the service, all these gift tags were collected up, put in the treasure box, and given to the family. Really nice. People can get involved. And you may be able to offer practical help on the day at church in a way. But really think about, can you do something on the day? And afterwards, after the christening, one of the interesting things about after our life event services is this, and I'll be saying more in another talk about this, but basically what we discovered was that we don't want people to see the day as an end in itself. We want them to see it as a beginning of a journey. We make promises to be there for them, even as they make promises. But then we do absolutely nothing to help them keep those promises. Nor do we keep our promise by contacting them and keeping in touch as a church. So think about how you build, as a church maybe, cross-generational friendships. A lot of our families, we say, are lonely. Can you make friends with them? talking to people in the community, making sure we do that invitational thing, telling people what's going on. You know, if it's near Christmas, do you want to come to our crib service? Shall I meet you at the end of the road? You know, if you're not familiar with it, here's some information just about that. And making sure, church, can you help with thinking through how your church feels to a family coming for the first time? What makes it accessible and unaccessible? Is it literally about feeling awkward with a buggy? Can you get a buggy in? Imagine walking up the path. Lots of our churches are not good for buggies at all, you know. And would you just feel that everyone looks at you if you try to bring a buggy in? Oh, sorry, we don't let buggies in here. I didn't know that. I didn't know you couldn't do that in church, you know. How do people feel when their baby cries and their toddler does toddlery things? Do you know, it's a lot easier in a lot of churches to let toddlers move than it is to try and get them to sit still. Moving will often keep them quieter than trying to keep them in one place. They're curious and interested in things, you know. I was always a slightly older toddler. I was always very struck by a child who was about 5 I was talking to in a church, and he appeared to be playing with toys the whole time in this church, in a sort of space at one side. And so I went to him and said, what do you like best about coming to church? And he made this incredibly expansive gesture. He looked up into the space, to the ceiling, forward to where the altar was, and he went, I like this, and I like this. I was like, oh, it's not about the toys, it's about being in this place. So helping us to think through how we make church feel like that, a place of awe and wonder. That's what we want our children to do. We want them to be astonished at the wonder of God. And we need to make sure that families get invited to fun times as well as to church worship times. There's probably less to say about weddings because it's harder for us as lay people to get involved in weddings. They often feel very mysterious. The days have gone when people from the village would stand at the gate watching a wedding take place. I remember that happening. You know, all the ladies would stand, oh, it's Mrs. So-and-so's daughter today, you know, and they'd all stand there. One of the things we have learned from our research is that weddings matter to couples for more deep reasons than we realise. It's very easy to assume they're choosing because it's pretty, but let's be honest, folks, in Wales, in England, in the whole of the UK, in the world now, there's a lot of pretty places to choose from. They don't have to choose a church. They can choose a castle, stately home, loads of places. So don't think they're choosing you because you're pretty. You might be, and that's a bonus. But of course, they're choosing you because they're in love and they've made this journey to marriage. And marriage is often the crown of their relationship. They see it as important. And they want a place that has meaning. And we know all this from research that we've done. So your place has meaning for some reason to them. Maybe because it's been part of their story, but maybe just because it feels like it's got more to it than a hotel would have. It's more significant. We find that the words matter to couples as well, and they'll often use something like, we want it to be traditional. And that doesn't quite so much mean old-fashioned as meaning something like hallowed by use, stood the test of time. This is about something bigger than just us. You know, we want to place our story in this context of the bigger story as well. And they want to have a really good experience, which is often where everyone in the community comes in. Now, you're very unlikely to be able to be there on the day unless you've got a special role. You may be a sides person, a verger, you might be a flower arranger, and in that sense you can perhaps be around and smile at guests. And what I would say is, if you're doing any job at church on the day of a wedding, I'd say 2 things. 1, the magic smiley thing. Smile at guests, say hi to them as you walk up and down the path. And the other thing is, if you're visible, just remember that most people dress up for weddings. It's special to them. I have a policy as a vicar, even though I'll be covered up with a black robe during the service, that on my short walk from the car to the church and back again, I will see the guests and I always wear something smart for a wedding, because they've all done that, and I think it's part of the same thing. So if you are, even if you're, obviously it's not easy if you're the florist because you've got an apron, that's less so, but if you're the verger or something, look as if you're there for them as well as part of that day. So you may be able to do that. Your big job will be praying, and your big job might also be welcoming, particularly when they come on the journey through, perhaps to hear bands read, perhaps to attend in order to make that connection with your church. So that's where your job will come in. So welcome them, be part of their story, be interested in them, offer to pray. let them be involved practically. You may be able to offer practical help. Some of the great stories that came out of weddings post-pandemic, when the doors first opened again, on that first day in July, when weddings could happen, were from churches who stepped into the breach. You know, where couples at the last minute suddenly found, yes, their wedding could go ahead, but nothing was possible. And churches stepped in and said, oh, we could do some flowers for you. You know, that is so memorable, so special about a community. We'll be there for you. So do what you can for people. And part of the challenge, of course, is just finding out that they're going on and making sure you've expressed to your clergy team, if you've got a team, you might not have a team, but if you have one, just saying, do you know what, I'm really interested in weddings in our church. I'd like to be praying for people when they come. Can you tell me about them? You know, just making sure that's part of what you're thinking about. And in the end, what happens is they become part of our story. We're part of their story, they're part of our story. We invite them to things, we invite them to come along, we listen to their stories, we share them. One of the loveliest things I've seen in a church, not that far actually, it was in the edge of the Forest of Dean, and they were putting on a kind of wedding fair in their own church, but as part of that, they did a display of weddings that had taken place down the years in their church. It had such a big impact. They got photos of people wearing wedding dresses, and actually they got 1 or 2 real wedding dresses on display from weddings that had actually taken place there, because we are part of people's stories and they are part of our story, and they're also part of God's story. And part of what we do as lay people with weddings is tell that story to others. Make sure people know. And we'll talk about communication a little bit more. But you can be part of passing on the good news that weddings do still take place at church, and they're open for everyone to come and find out about them. So hopefully you can think of a way that you can be welcoming, that you can pray, and you may even have a practical job that you can do.